New Orleans is one of the most unique cities in the United States. Things like jazz music and distinct cuisines are some of the many things New Orleans is known for. A small group of friends and I went to New Orleans for the first time a few years ago. I'm the thrill seeker of the group. I always try to find something fun for us to do whenever we travel. Another interesting thing New Orleans is known for is city ghost tours. My friend Connor wasn't too thrilled about going. In his words, he didn't want to do anything involved with ghosts or spirits, but he was overruled because everyone else wanted to go. When we arrived in the heart of the city, known as the French Quarter, that is where we met our city tour guide. At first he gave us the usual spiel about the areas and places we were about to see. Our tour guide even had a story of his own. He mentioned that his home was built on part of a former plantation. What he said next was a bit unsettling. The tour guide said he has a recurring experience with a voodoo spirit on his property. Everyone's ears perked up when he told this story, and while doing so, leading us inside a house which to this day still creeps me out. As we stood in the living room, everyone observed the strange images we saw. There were human-like scratches over one of the walls. We then followed him into a large room known to be haunted. I did a quick head count of everyone, including the tour guide. There were 22 of us in total. It felt like a lucky number because my birthday is on the 22nd. When we entered the room, a few people were a bit nervous. I was excited, but also nervous at the same time. The tour guide told everyone to stand still and to be quiet. He did a brief exercise where he asked everyone to introduce themselves with the lights completely off. This made the experience more horrifying. I was standing next to my friend Connor and felt him grab my jacket. Soon enough, one by one, each person in the room introduced themselves. As we continued going around the room, it got colder. Suddenly, a girl in the group started freaking out in the corner of the room. It sounded like she was getting a panic attack, so the tour guide immediately turned on the lights to see if she was okay. When he turned on the lights, everyone was looking around to see who was having the reaction, but to our surprise, no one was in the corner. Bear in mind, the room was silent. If anyone were there, we would have heard footsteps or movements. There were no speakers or camera inside the room with the lights on. The look on everyone's face was pure shock. Even I couldn't shake the noises we had just heard a few moments ago. The tour ended abruptly. Out of curiosity, I pulled the guy aside and told him I counted 21 heads when we came in. He said to me, "That's impossible. The maximum number of admissions for a tour is 20. A few years ago, I was walking on the beach with my friend Reed in San Diego, California, when I saw a guy lying face down in the ocean. He was maybe 10 feet away from the shore. Reed didn't notice at first until he saw me running towards the water. It took the strength of the two of us to drag the guy on the sand. When we flipped him over, the guy was unconscious. The first thought that came to mind was he needed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. The only problem was, neither of us had first aid training. I told Reed to dial 911 while I attempted CPR. My only knowledge of what I was about to do was what I'd seen on TV. I did mouth-to-mouth for maybe a minute, but that minute felt like forever as I waited for any sign of consciousness. And then finally, I heard the guy take a deep breath. In that moment, I felt relieved knowing that I helped save this guy's life, but that feeling didn't last much longer. When the guy exhaled, about 10 marine isopods came out of his nostrils. That's when I realized that I had been blowing air into a corpse. His skin was already pale. The more I looked, I could see his body was bloated, which explained why he was so heavy to drag out of the water. When the police arrived, they confirmed the identity of this guy. He was a high school student that had been missing for 3 days. I felt bad that I wasn't able to help, but felt even worse for his family. Their missing child had been found with the worst possible outcome. About 5 years ago, while living in Detroit, Michigan, I worked at a kiosk in a local mall. I worked most weeknights and was responsible for making deposits and closing up the kiosk before I left. One of the main things I didn't like was being one of the last persons to leave after the mall had closed. One night, I finished everything that needed to be done, said goodnight to other workers near me, and made my way to the exit. It was around 10:35 p.m. When I came outside, my car was the only one left in the parking lot. I got inside and pulled out my cell phone. I was browsing through my WhatsApp messages when I saw a car come into my section of the parking lot from around the corner of the building, into a spot maybe 75 feet away from me and parked. I went back to scrolling through my messages. Then I noticed some motion which made me look up again. The car circled around a bit but pulled into another spot and stopped. It seemed a bit strange, but then again, some people are strange. Over the next few minutes, I kept looking up from my phone and observed the car slowly driving around the parking lot, picking a random spot, remaining there for a few seconds, then moving to another. I ignored it and decided to finish replying to the last few messages. When I was finished, I put my phone in the empty passenger seat and started the car. When I looked up, the car was nowhere to be seen. I looked to the front of me, then to my left and my right, and also my rearview mirror, and saw nothing. Suddenly, my eye catches movement to the right. It's the car pulling into the spot next to me. It came from behind with the headlights turned off. The entire time it was driving around, the headlights were turned on and much further away from me. I was startled and instantly got a bad feeling. I quickly locked the door. I looked in the rearview mirror as I drove away, and the car just sat there in the spot next to the one I had just been in. Between the strange behavior and the headlights turned off, anything could have happened. When I was 12 years old, I remember visiting my friend Mason in Cincinnati. We were taking Mason's dog, a Siberian Husky, out for a walk late that night. Getting caught up in conversation, our walk extended a bit longer than we anticipated and walked further into his neighborhood. As we approached the corner of the new block, we ran into a tall man smoking a cigarette, walking in the opposite direction towards us. He stopped walking when he saw the three of us. He flicked his cigarette and started to smile. We didn't know if he was being friendly or wanted to start a conversation, but we continued walking past him. About 2 minutes later, Mason looked back, nudged me, and said the man was walking behind us. The man pretended to look in another direction when he saw us both staring back at him. There was no one else walking on the street but us, which made the feeling much more ominous. We both started to get uncomfortable. I told Mason, let's make our way back to his house. We turned onto a different block and started walking down the street. Moments later, I turned around again and there he was. The guy was following us. The faster we started to walk, the closer he got to us. I kid you not, my heart stopped when the man reached for Mason by the shirt and started pulling him away. Mason screamed out loud instantly. His Siberian Husky started barking uncontrollably. He was so aggressive that he attacked the guy holding Mason. The dog ripped into the man's leg and he started screaming. It caught the attention of one of the neighbors who turned on their porch light. The man was forced to let go of Mason, who then pulled the Husky away. He limped away as fast as he could when the neighbor came outside to help. As I looked down, I saw traces of the man's blood on the sidewalk. We saw the guy getting further and further away. The neighbor, an older gentleman, he pulled out his cell phone to call the police, then gave us the phone to call our parents. Eventually, the man was caught by the police on that same night. If it were not for my friend's dog, Mason would have been kidnapped. During my first year in college, I accepted a summer job as a temp secretary. After the initial 2-day training, I was left alone at the office on the 3rd day. A few of my responsibilities were to answer all incoming phone calls, file paperwork, and respond to company emails. I received a strange email with no title. Even though it seemed a bit suspicious, I didn't want to overlook anything since I was still new on the job. When I clicked the link inside, the computer screen froze. I tried repeatedly to move the cursor, but nothing happened. The screen was completely locked, forcing me to restart the computer. Moments later, I was able to log on successfully. Only now, it appeared all the files saved on the desktop were completely wiped. I frantically clicked the mouse trying to search for any files I could find. Then suddenly, the screen went black. A scary-looking clown filled the screen of the desktop. I backed away from the computer so fast that I almost fell off the chair. I called my boss and told him I had an emergency and left. To this day, I wasn't sure if it was a sick prank or someone was hacking the computer. I grew up in West Palm Beach, Florida in the late 90s. Walking alone to the convenience store wasn't a big deal back then. It was the perfect excuse for me to get out of the house and go for a treat. To avoid walking along the main road, I typically cut through the back of the mall to get to the store. One night, just after 9 o'clock, I was walking back home and saw a strange man standing in the spot I had not too long ago passed. He smiled as I started walking by. Moments later, I heard footsteps running behind me. I stopped and looked over my shoulder. It was the same guy, but he ran straight past. I was startled because I thought maybe he was running to catch the bus or across the street. That's when I noticed he stopped running and crouched down towards the ground. It looks like he was tying his shoe. I quickly started walking by, but something told me to look down while walking past him. The guy wasn't tying his shoelace. He was pulling a knife out of his boots. When our eyes connected, I immediately started running. I turned around to see him running directly behind me with the knife in his hand. I dropped the bag I was carrying from the convenience store and ran as fast as I could. I noticed a gray pickup truck that stopped near the red light and started screaming for help. The driver instantly pulled down his window. I told him there was a guy running after me. The driver got out of his car, tackled the guy, and called the cops. It turns out the guy wielding the knife was homeless. When the officers arrived and patched him down, they found drugs and needles in his pocket. I still get a bit shaken up when I tell this story, because had I not seen the driver of that car, I could have gotten robbed or worse. Unit 421. Those words I remember hearing over and over again, looking through the peephole at the officers in the apartment facing mine. The couple that lived next door seemed pretty normal at first. I would hear the occasional laughter or TV playing whenever I got home, but over the past few weeks, the laughter I heard started changing to arguments. I would hear the husband yelling at his wife. Some nights their arguments were so intense I could hear her cry. I felt terrible knowing that they were always at each other and not happy. It got to a point that hearing them argue every day wasn't a surprise anymore. One night while getting ready to go to work for the overnight shift, I heard the argument start. There were accusations of cheating, jealousy, and rage. The yelling got louder, doors were slamming, and at one point, it sounded like something shattered inside their apartment. I grew more anxious as I grabbed the keys to leave the apartment. When I got down to the lobby, I told the concierge what I had heard upstairs. They said they would look into it. When I got home the next morning around 5 a.m., I immediately went to bed and took a nap. About 3 hours later, I woke up by hearing a lot of scuffle and banging outside the hallway. I was also hearing a lot more voices than usual, then a shriek of someone crying at the top of their lungs. I walked to my apartment door and saw an officer consoling a woman in the hallway. It turned out her sister, the woman that lived across from me, was murdered by her husband. Her husband found out that she was cheating on him, and in a fit of rage, he killed her, left her body inside the apartment. My grandmother told me this story last year in New York City when we were in lockdown. When she was in her 20s, she worked as a cashier in her neighborhood. Some nights she would take the bus home, mostly during winter when it was cold. But in the summer, she would walk home. This one particular night, she worked a little later than usual. Her shift usually ends at 7 p.m., but another cashier called in sick, so she stayed until past 8. My grandmother contemplated taking the bus, but she opted to walk home, which would have taken her about 15 minutes. About 10 minutes away from home, she started walking by a bus stop. There was one person waiting, an older man wearing a gray shirt, dark jeans, and shaggy hair. As she walked closer to him, she nodded and said good evening, to be nice. This is where things got weird. The man replied, "Good evening, how's it going?" Then he said it again, and then a third time. Each time he said it, he walked closer and closer towards my grandmother. My grandmother continued walking away, but every time she turned around, he was still following her. She feared for her safety and randomly walked into a nearby gas station. She took her time pretending to look for something to purchase. After about 2 minutes, she grabbed a bottle of water, paid for it, and nervously walked back outside. Thankfully, the weird guy was gone. Every so often, she would turn around to make sure he wasn't there. She felt a sigh of relief when she made it to her doorstep. As she proceeded to lock the front door, she looked ahead and the creepy guy was standing on the street. My grandmother said the guy had followed her home. She immediately yelled that she was going to call the police, and the guy fled on foot. Since that night, she refused to walk home from work. I used to love sitting on this swing in my backyard at night as a kid. Back then, even now in my 20s, I find the experience to be cathartic. However, I had the opposite reaction after my recent experience in June 2021. Bloods Point Road. That is the name of a street near my new neighborhood. Growing up, I'd heard things about this place. Bad things. Stories I didn't quite understand or ever believed. What drew me to the area was the scenery, and one of my close friends that lived 3 houses down. My property is right at the edge of a large and densely wooded area. I hadn't seen much of the neighborhood since I moved on June 1st. To be honest, there wasn't much time for me to do anything. Once I left work, I would come home to unpack boxes or relax. There were no swings in my backyard, but one day driving home, I discovered a park not too far away from my house. One night during the second week of June, I decided to go to the park. It was just past 10 o'clock that night. Usually I wouldn't be out so late, but I had the following day off and needed some fresh air. I grabbed my keys, headphones to play music, and a can of beer, then made my way to the park. This was my first time venturing outside since I moved. For some reason, The moment I stepped onto my driveway, I got this really weird feeling, the kind of feeling you have like you're being watched. Thinking nothing of it, I proceeded to walk towards the swings nearby. Every step I took, the uneasy feeling got stronger and stronger. I could feel it in my stomach. My body was alarmed about something, but I couldn't tell what it was. I came to a complete stop, about 10 feet away from the swings, and began to look around and at the woods nearby. I didn't see anyone, but something was seriously wrong. I tried to force the feeling out of my head and sat down on the swing. The strange part is, once I sat down, I felt scared. I popped open the can of beer and selected a song from iTunes to take the edge off. About a minute and 30 seconds into the song, the feeling continued to get stronger. The best way to describe it was, I felt like prey. My gut was telling me that if I sat there much longer, something terrible was going to happen. I turned off my music and just sat there. I forgot about my beer and continued looking around at the woods, and for a moment, everything got completely silent. My body froze when I looked beside me. With absolutely no wind blowing, the swing started moving. It was as if someone was sitting there. The swing continued moving back and forth. Everything I was feeling the entire time since I was sitting here hit an all-time high. Physically, I could barely breathe. I knocked over the can of beer and literally started running back towards the house. When I got inside, I closed and locked the door. It may have been late at night, but I turned on every single light within reach. I don't know how else to say this, but something was in that park. The next morning, I started retracing everything that happened. I decided to give my friend a call who lives just up the street. He invited me over, and I told him what I'd experienced the night before. He told me that he usually likes to go jogging, but also had a similar experience to mine. That's when it hit me. Everything I've heard all these years were true. You see, Blood's Point Road is one of the top haunted roads in the world. It has a terrifying reputation linked to deadly accidents, murders, hangings, and the most disturbing of them all, hauntings. I've only been living here for a few months now, and I can tell you, every single night, I think about what happened to me in the park. This story happened when I was 5 years old. Some of the details I remember vividly, but I also heard a version from my aunt, who was also a big part of this story. When I was 3 years old, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. Obviously I didn't know what it was at that time, but I do remember being around other relatives a lot more. Over the next 2 years, my mom moved into a hospital and was placed on morphine. During this time, I was staying with my aunt, her husband, and 2 cousins. One day, I was sitting in the living room playing with my toys. My aunt sat on the couch watching me play, while probably watching something on TV. Across the room, I had one of those toy rotary phones on wheels. It had a smiley face, red speaker, and a string to pull it around with you. According to my aunt, the phone started ringing. Kind of weird, since they don't actually make noise except when you rotate the dial. The phone was ringing constantly, so I walked across the room, picked it up, and according to my aunt, my exact words on the phone were, "Hi Mom, okay, I'll be good," and hung up the phone. My aunt thought I had a wild imagination, but I remember what I heard. I sat back down to continue playing with my toys when the house phone rang. When my aunt answered, it was the hospital, calling to say my mom had passed away 10 minutes prior. I know this sounds crazy to some people, but that was the last conversation I had with my mother.